Hello YouTube. Today I will be responding to an article posted to The Daily Beast. The article is titled, HBO Slammed for Sexual Violence Against Women in Its Shows, and it's by someone named Kevin Fallon. Critics take HBO to task for its excessive and persistent use of female rape and violence in its dramas. Asked to explain, the network seems surprised to hear that it's an issue at all. Frankly, I'm surprised they seem surprised, given the outrage that has occurred online over the treatment of the character Sansa in Game of Thrones. Perhaps HBO just isn't aware of the state of feminism in modern America. The critical accolades for HBO's gripping crime drama The Night Of has been more than deserved. But the reaction has been so intensely positive that, it seems, HBO seemed unprepared for one very blatant, resonant criticism, and one that's been lobbied against many of the network's shows for years. Why does HBO keep relying on sexual violence against women as major plot points for its shows, occasionally even fetishizing it? Well, there's a very simple answer for that. It's a very easy way to get the audience emotionally involved in the story. We as a society care deeply about what happens to women, and we care especially when sexual violence happens to women. So if you want to create a lot of high drama and tension, an easy way to do it is to have one character inflict sexual violence upon a female character. It's also a really simple way to get the audience to hate a character, because everyone hates people who commit sexual violence against women. The Night Of centers around a man, Nasir, played by Riz Ahmed, accused of the gruesome murder of a New York City woman. The two had shared a night of sex and drugs. The next morning, Naz wakes up in her kitchen, goes to say goodbye, and finds her body there naked and bloodied with 22 knife wounds. It's an image that replays dozens of times over the course of the series. I wasn't aware that stabbing 22 times with a knife was a form of sexual violence. But then again, I'm not a particularly kinky person. Perhaps the fact that she's naked is the sexual aspect, but I find it odd that the naked part seems to trump the 22 knife wounds part in determining if this form of violence is sexual or not. I suspect maybe that the issue is that this is brutal violence committed against a woman, but we'll get back to that. At Sunday night's HBO session at the Television Critics Association, critics brought up that The Night Of isn't the network's only big new series that uses sexual violence against women as a major plot point, with an image of a woman's violated body as a narrative refrain. Well, that's not surprising, really. As I already mentioned, having female victims is an easy way to draw the audience into the story. You might even go so far as to call it lazy writing, except that it's so consistently effective. Just prior to Sunday's session, critics received their first screeners of Westworld, the buzzy new Western thriller about a Wild West theme park where guests can pretend to be gunslingers, alongside androids programmed to be authentic townies, that premieres in October. Evan Rachel Wood plays one such android, whose bloodied naked body is the first image of the entire series. Again, an effective way to draw the viewer in. Two doesn't make a trend, but counting Game of Thrones, The Sopranos, Deadwood, Rome, and more in HBO's past dramas, to say that there is a trend of gratuitous and pervasive and female rape and violence that isn't balanced by male characters on these shows would be an understatement. Well, that would depend on what you mean by balanced. Yes, it's unlikely that the amount of sexual violence would not be balanced, but that's because we as a society don't really give a shit about sexual violence done against men. The rape of a man is a much less effective way to get the audience emotionally involved in a scene. In fact, the rape of a man is probably just as likely to elicit laughter as sympathy. I also have to wonder why, when you're listing off HBO dramas, you chose to exclude the HBO show that probably had more sexual violence against men than every show ever made combined. I'm talking, of course, about Oz. One of my favorite shows of all time, Oz frequently used rape as a plot device, and often went into detail as to the physical and emotional trauma rape can cause. Yet, despite the fact that it aired at the same time as The Sopranos for much of its run, you chose to not mention it. I wonder why. And so, as HBO's new president of programming, Casey Bloys, took the hot seat to talk to the critics wanted to know, what the hell? His response? A sweaty squirm, and the physical realization of that shrugging emoji. In fact, Bloys' response, at first a version of writing it off, and then an argument that is part of just a general propensity for violence in HBO shows, was so dissatisfactory that it received not just one, but 2 follow-ups from critics clearly fed up with the trope and demanding an intelligent answer. Poor guy. He's clearly not up to date on modern popular feminism. He probably still has the misguided notion that violence is bad, no matter what kind it is or who it's done to. Linda Holmes from NPR kicked off the questioning, asking if the network is relying on sexualized violence against women as a way to create stakes and drive the narrative. Instinctively bringing up Game of Thrones, Bloys said the violence is not just specific to women, it's men and women. It's kind of indiscriminate. Which is completely true. In fact, significantly more men than women are slaughtered in every way in Game of Thrones. Yet I see no critics getting up in arms at the number of men being savagely murdered. But then again, I, like poor Mr. Bloys, consider violence of all kinds to be bad. When she followed up, Bloys reiterated that he didn't think the violence is specific to women. Plenty of men are killed as well, he said, setting off a hashtag TCA16 firestorm on Twitter. Well, I hope said firestorm was in agreement with that claim, but I doubt it. I suspect it was a bunch of people explaining how it doesn't matter that men are killed because the question was about sexual violence against women, which is obviously so much worse than anything that ever happens to men, including their violent death. Writer Melanie McFarlane then asked if that means that we'll be seeing more of the same kind of violence, specifically rape, with male characters. Bloys joked, "We're gonna kill everybody." Eric Deegans at NPR took the final stab at the question, explicating the difference between violence against women and generalized violence, that there's a difference between what happens to Game of Thrones, a dismemberment per se, and rape against women, which is a particular kind of violence that is about oppressing women. Poor Mr. Bloys. Don't you understand? Rape is worse than murder and male dismemberment, because feminists can pretend it's motivated by oppression. It doesn't matter if literally thousands of men are killed in a show, because if one rape of one female character happens, it is absolutely unacceptable. The violence is pretty extreme on all fronts, he said. A fair PRing of a tough question, but missing the point. That there's a boiling point rising in the frustration over what has, with its gender imbalance and frequency, become a misogynistic trope on TV. And, if there isn't, that perhaps it's uniquely on television could be contributing to a desensitizing over it. A misogynistic trope? If by that you mean a trope wherein bad guys are misogynistic, then I guess. But the very fact that this is a trope is proof positive that people, the viewers, care deeply about what happens to female characters. For bad guys to be bad guys, they have to do things that the audience hates them for. So if bad guys are routinely raping women, it's because the audience hates people who rape women. As for desensitizing, no, you fucking meathead. If people were desensitized to it, It would no longer be an effective method of drawing people into the story. If you want to talk about desensitization, let's talk about all the men killed in nearly every HBO show and how little you care about it. But Blois did concede. I take your point. So far, there aren't any male rapes. He went on, but the violence is spread equally. Which again, this particular kind of violence is not. When Degens pressed back, Blois insinuated that, in Westworld particularly, the violence is slightly different because it's against an android-like human and not an actual human. Oi. But did end with a mea culpa. To your larger point of is it something we think about? Yeah, he said. I think the criticism is valid, you know? So I think it's something that people take into account. Yes, I don't doubt writers will start taking into account the reactionary lunatics who don't understand how storytelling works, and the result will be worse fiction. In defense of Blois, who found himself subject to the firing squad, he was clearly not prepared or expecting the questions. You could watch him realize, as he was speaking, that he very much did not have a good answer for it. Still, as the Hollywood Reporter's Daniel Feinberg noted, the correct response to questions about violence against women you haven't considered is not jokes. Except that the conversation is about violence against fictional women, and thus it's silly. And that's an important distinction. You may not be able to tell the difference between fiction and reality, but for those of us who can, it's perfectly okay to joke about what happens to fictional characters, no matter what's happening to them. As for you, quote-unquote, defending Blois, yeah, sure. After you spent the majority of the article bashing him and insinuating that he's probably a massive sexist, now you're going to defend him. Right. The way that we cover it in the news, treat victims and survivors as a society, and yes, portray it with alarming frequency on television, there is, to use Vanity Fair's Joanna Robinson's characterization, an epidemic of dehumanizing victims of sexual violence. By whom? Who is doing this? Who is dehumanizing victims of sexual violence other than you? Expecting victims to go through the criminal justice process is not dehumanizing them. In reality, we as a society care extremely deeply about female victims of sexual violence. This whole idea that victims are dehumanized and treated poorly is nothing but fiction. And portraying something on television is not automatically dehumanizing it. If done properly, it's actually one of the best ways to humanize a violent act. A well-written story can show you the motivations behind the act and the consequences to the victim. If anything, anti-sexual violence advocates should be asking for more sexual violence on television as long as it's handled in a humanizing fashion, much as rape was used on Oz. On Westworld, Evan Rachel Wood plays a robot. Excusing the disturbing storyline because of its sci-fi removed from so-called real life, it's not the same, she's a robot, is an irresponsible way to address the epidemic. For what it's worth, by the way, it's as horrifying to witness and explore the ramification of rape on a human-like android played by Evan Rachel Wood as it would if the actress was playing an actual human. To you, maybe, but for the rest of us, it's not the same she's a robot is a perfectly valid way to address it. And what epidemic? There is no epidemic of sexual violence in America except in fictional feminist statistics. We don't live in the Congo. But thanks for making my point. If the rape of Evan Rachel Wood's character causes you to be horrified by its ramifications, then that show is doing a great job of humanizing the experience of rape. Surely the fact that this rape is horrifying to the audience is way more effective in teaching men not to rape than 10 feminist consent classes. It's worth noting, as Vox's Todd Vanderwerf did on Twitter, that Westworld and The Night Of were conceived of and produced years apart. It's the fact that they are premiering so close together that heightens the comparisons, and could make it perceived that a cognizant decision. Nonetheless, it's a systematic issue with not just HBO programming, but prestige cable programming in general. Hell, broadcast drama is as bad, if not worse, but TV standards keep the imagery from being as graphic. and you would think that a network would have a sense of a growing climate of frustration surrounding it and have a better answer prepared. You would think so, but the fact is that violence against women is a really effective story element, and it's really difficult to come up with something equally effective. If you want this to change, there's one way to do it, but you won't like it. You would need to make society not care about violence against women any more than they care about violence against men. I know, I don't see it happening either. So you'll just have to live with sexual violence against women being a common story trope. Or, of course, you can whine about it, get writers to stop doing it, and increase the quality of storytelling across the board. It's up to you. It's fitting, then, that when a few hours later the cast and creative team of Westworld walked on stage to face the critics, producer Lisa Joy did have a better answer prepared. Asked point blank to address the controversy that had been brewing for all of about 180 minutes, Joy addressed it in a thoughtful, meticulous manner. Because of the debate and controversy the conversation with the session with Blois stirred, we thought it fair to print her response in full. Now, I haven't read her statement yet, but I'd be willing to bet that they're posting her response in full because it fits their narrative really well. I'll be amazed if violence against men is given anything but lip service, but we'll see. That's a great question. It was definitely something that was heavily discussed and heavily considered as we worked on those scenes. Westworld is an examination of human nature. The best parts of human nature. We explore paternal love, romantic love, and finding oneself. But also the basest parts of human nature. And that includes violence. That includes sexual violence. Violence and sexual violence have sadly been a fact of human history since the beginning of human history. There's something about us, thankfully not the majority of us, but there are people who engage in violence. It continues to this day. So when we were tackling a project about a park in which the premise is that you can come there and do whatever you want, whatever desire you have, with impunity, without consequence, it seems like it was an issue that we had to address. Now, when addressing it, there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. Sexual violence, not only for me, but for everybody on our team, is an issue we take very, very seriously. It's extraordinarily disturbing and horrifying. In this portrayal, we really endeavored for it not to be about the fetishization of those acts. It is about exploring the crime and establishing the crime, and the torment of the characters within the story, and exploring the stories, hopefully, with dignity and depth. Okay, I was wrong. That was a really good answer. Is this a perfect answer? Not by any means. As Holmes, who kicked off the whole discussion, noted on Twitter, it's a relatively pat answer, used to give some sort of noble justification that absolves the creators from being complicit in an icky problem or trend. Nobody says, "We rape in an insensitive way," Holmes tweeted. Icky? What is with social justice types in that word? It's in my experience that icky is a word used with children. But yeah, what do you expect? You're freaking out repeatedly about bad things happening to fictional characters. Well, I've got news for you. Bad things have been happening to fictional characters for as long as fiction has existed, and that's not going to change. What you're doing is trying to prevent writers from using one specific type of bad thing because you personally are offended by it. What you don't get is that that's the whole fucking point. You're supposed to be offended by the bad things that happens to characters you care about. All that means is the show is doing what it's supposed to. And if you don't like it, if it's too much for you, if you can't handle it, change the channel. Don't watch that show. But please, don't pretend like a show including rape in its story is somehow going to make rape more common or make things worse for rape victims. That's not the way the world works. Plus, it's problematic to take an issue like this and simply go show by show and ask for justification. As the reaction in the room suggests, this isn't a case-by-case issue. It's an industry-wide problem. The question now is, can it be solved? I've already gone over this. You can remove a particular trope from fiction if you whine loudly and frequently enough about it, thereby making fiction worse. I wouldn't call that solving anything, though. And of course, you don't want to look at things on a case-by-case basis, because then you have to worry about that pesky little thing called context. Because, as we all know, it doesn't matter the reasons why a rape was depicted, how it was depicted, or how tastefully the act and the consequences are portrayed. No, what matters is that rape was depicted, and that's wrong, because rape is a tool used to oppress women, whereas the countless deaths and acts of violence committed against men are completely meaningless, and there's absolutely no reason to care about them whatsoever. And that's the end of the article. There's of course no comment section, because this is not a conversation, it's a lecture. The one thing that really gets me about this whole article is that this is a person who writes about media poorly. This is someone who watches a lot of television, a lot of media, and probably considers themselves an expert. And yet he is unable to figure out the very simple reason why sexual violence against women is used so often in storytelling. His ideological lens has so warped his thinking that it's inconceivable to him that the vast majority of people care deeply about what happens to women. He can't conceive of that because his entire worldview is based on the assumption that women are widely oppressed, hated, and looked down upon. From his worldview then, sexual violence is not a good way to draw sympathy from the audience. It's merely a sadistic method of depicting the violence done to an oppressed class. To him, it's the equivalent of having a common trope be the lynching of a black character. His reaction is the same as most people's would be if HBO shows routinely had black characters enslaved and hung from the branch of a tree. This is your brain on social justice, people. It's not a good drug. Until next time, I'm Positive Improvement, and I wish you all the best.